Welcome, one and all. Today's session is people, 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 and HR. So, growing your organization successfully means relying on people, i.e., your staff, to deliver. And behind these people has to be a capable leader or leadership, and we're here to talk all about it. If you're new here, I'm Rania Francoeur, and the usual format is we start off with Randall Craig sharing a few thoughts, then we flip into Q&A. So, for those who don't yet know Randall, he has founded several successful startups. He's held a long-time position at a Big Four consulting firm. He was a senior executive at an American public company, author of 8 books in the Speaker Hall of Fame, master facilitator. He's helped over 100 organizations scale, and he works with me at the Brain Trust Professional Institute, helping organizations grow their businesses with executive coaching, leadership retreats, and facilitating conversations to align teams. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Come on, Mike. We'd be happy to have you ask your questions. But let's get started. Randall, where do you want to start with this important conversation about HR? What's different now that you want us to be sensitive to?
What I'd like to do is set a bit of a framework, and really, there's two story arcs that to an organization's success. There's the long-term growth, which is driven by strategy and it's powered by uh, long-term people decisions, and there's a short-term achievement of growth, um, and that's driven by quarterly goals and is powered by the day-to-day management. And I wanted to sort of speak about those two arcs because if we think about the role of strategic HR leadership, um, that's changed over time. And I find it very interesting because, way back when in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, this is generations ago, it was the personnel office and somebody who was in charge of personnel. Which is interesting. And then that transitioned to HR, and we had somebody responsible for human relations, right? And now the in vogue title is people, and of course the chief people officer because we're now sort of in charge of people. But if we think about how these sort of titles and positioning, if you will, for that most senior HR role, when it was personnel, and of course I certainly wasn't there back then. I don't think that that role particularly had a seat at the executive table. And if you look at it now, it's pretty central. But between then and now, what's happened and what does that speak to the future? And the reason why I'm starting this way is because if we think about it way back when, actually even call it a decade, several decades ago, what was HR? It was internal communication. It was recruiting. It was training. It was mentorship. It was career planning. It was troubleshooting. It was performance appraisal. It was payroll. It was an alumni program for people who left, but you still wanted to connections, etc. There's all of those things that were under the rubric of HR. And then, of course, we got into a time when the economy started to shrink and there's a lot of cost pressures and gee, do we need all these kinds of things? All of a sudden, we ended up with an HR function. I'm just using the word HR, but I acknowledge we call it people now usually, where the role was shrunken down to recruiting, but it was really more recruiting management because a lot of that often was outsourced. Payroll, which by the way was also outsourced, HRIS, Human Resources Information System, which by the way is outsourced, and a lot of the role that the chief people officer, chief HR officer did was really more about making sure the transactions kind of happened in order to allow the people to, quote, focus on what the people actually needed to focus. Now, like every pendulum that goes from one side to the other and then back again, I think we're starting to realize that perhaps it's not just a question of HR as a HR as a transactional system and a transactional leader, but the question about where does HR fit in from a strategic. So I don't know if we're ever going to go back to the good old days of being responsible for everything. Okay. I don't know many CEOs who say, yes, we're going to bulk up our internal training department. We're going to bulk up our mentoring, our career growth. And I think that's in a certain sense unfortunate. But on the other hand, it's a function of really where we are. But that pendulum we think is sort of swinging back a little bit where the issue is if we do in fact want to be strategic about our people being the differentiator, then perhaps we need to achieve what was lost when we did all these cuts into this transactional model, but perhaps we can achieve the objectives using a different way. And therefore, perhaps the role of the chief HR officer, the chief people officer, whatever the particular title, is one where you're both functioning at both of those story arcs, that long-term growth driven by strategy and powered by those long-term people decisions, and the shorter-term story arc, which is really driven by let's make sure we meet our numbers every quarter. Let's make sure that we power the people, from a day-to-day kind of kind of role. So that's kind of where I wanted to start a little bit. But I also wanted to perhaps speak to a um, bit of an, pardon me, I'd like to speak a little bit to a certain elephant in the room, which is um, which is where AI fits in. You know, how do we know, for example, that the best employees in the future aren't actually going to be AI agent type employees, agentic employees, if you will, where they could make decisions, they can process, they could do things perhaps better than real people, and therefore maybe as companies start to say, how do we become an AI first organization? Well, first of all, let me just say that eventually every organization will be an AI integrated organization. But, you know, if we're going to integrate AI-based employees in it, what's the role of the senior HR leadership? Is it to be the voice of reason and the um, pointer out of risk and etc.? Is it, for example, to be the voice of driving it forward and being ahead of the curve and dealing with that as well? So I think that we'll see where the conversation and the questions actually come, but I think that that's something that's um, kind of an interesting development, and we've already seen little bits and pieces of that coming up in the news about. And it's not just a question of how do we reduce our cost of service, but the question is how do we use our people strategically to move the organization to that next level, and perhaps we can have some of the less strategic work, if you will, um, be done with technology. So all of a sudden, at one point the HR folks were the touchy-feelies. Then they were the transactive. And now all of a sudden, now there's this AI dimension. Okay. Once again, it is a strategic role. And the best HR leaders are looking at that way, not just as tactical transaction processors or as generic process owners, but it should be and it can be much more.
Randall, when you said elephant in the room, I thought you were going to point out that we have senior HR consultant Leona here on the call, which makes it really interesting because we're going to have HR from CEO perspective from you, Randall, over your, decades as CEO. And then we have Leona here. Flavian, do you want us anything like top of mind buzzing around your ears that you want to talk about in terms of HR? You're just here to listen.
Well, when Randall talks, I listen. So that
You're kind.
that goes without saying. AI first organization is it's the first I've heard of that actual phrase. Everyone I know is just thinking about it and just talking about it, and we work with a lot of interns from the universities, and so I find a dramatic difference between those interns who are exposed to a paid version of one of the AI language learning models compared to those who use a free version and don't really understand it.
So Flavian, let me sort of push a little bit here and say what you're describing is exceptionally scary. Okay, because I can guarantee you if you're to do your startup, say, um, 2, 3, 4 years from now, you would not be having the interns in. You would be using AI as the intern, right? I think that this is one of the biggest challenges because internships are an amazing way for organizations, particularly larger ones, test drive a prospective employee, etc. But gee, when you could just ask the AI, which is kind of like an overgrown intern anyway, to do something, okay, likely it can do it fast, better, and frankly, despite some hallucinations, you always have to check the intern's work, but it does it all without complaint, faster, better, cheaper, right? And as a result of that, the challenge for organizations to either test drive that next cohort, if you will, coming in, perhaps the intern's job is going to be very, very different. You're right. I think with respect to those who are exposed to it and those who are not exposed to it, there's a big difference. Do we need to be AI experts? No, but we need to understand how to do prompt engineering. In our AI toolkit, we sort of have a particular framework we think works particularly well. There's a whole bunch of other ones as well. But I think it's a real difference. I also think that you touched on something perhaps that twigged in me, which is there's a big difference between using AI to improve workflow, okay, to do something a little faster, right? But I think the real opportunity is actually transformative. Okay, how do we use this to transform what our business is? Okay, how do we recognize where the risk to our business is if we get, say, disintermediated because a client thinks that why hire this company? We could just use AI to do the whole function. Okay, better, faster, cheaper, right? So I think that boards and I think senior executive teams sometimes, due to the pressure of achieving like driving towards quarterly results, etc., are not spending the time they need to. And I think that's it's a sweeping generalization. I know that, but I don't think they're spending the time necessary to say, okay, so what are the bets we need to make as a management team or as a board to say, okay, how do we use this as a way to uh, understand what's happening from a disruption perspective in our industry and our sector? Okay, where are the opportunities? Where are the blank spaces that perhaps we could fill in? Where are the areas that frankly are going to be uh, you know, swallowed up? For example, one of our coaching clients, um, a year or two back, a big chunk of their business was writing reports for large financial institutions for public consumption, basically doing a whole ton of writing. Well, thank you very much. AI can do what, 80% of that, right? Much faster. So they could turn things around quite dramatically and have a massive margin increase. But from a client's perspective, it's like, heck, why don't we do that 80% by putting a nice prompt in, right? And so the whole question of transformative use of AI in HR is something that's really important. You know, why should screening interviews be done by a person? Can they not be done using an AI agent, for example? I would argue that just like there's hallucinations when you use these large language models, I'm not so sure I personally at this point would trust an AI agent to do those screening interviews, but you can use them to do a glorified bozo test, to weed out the most egregious of those who don't meet certain criteria. I mean, video interviewing's been around for a while now, so I know that strays a bit from your question, Flavian, but I think that there's this whole drive to incrementalism as opposed to transformative change is endemic and well beyond just the HR function. I think, though, that for HR leaders to be at the table and to say, here's where the possibilities actually are. Here's this pilot project or this test that we might want to run just to see how that works for us and also build some organizational knowledge since we're talking about AI right now, right? As opposed to sitting in the back of the bus when IT is in the driver's seat or maybe marketing is in the driver's seat. Okay, well, if people are what are driving the organization, perhaps HR should take their turn in the driver's seat anyway, or at least be there advising, coaching, etc., the CEO and others on what the impact is, rather than it being kind of an afterthought. So, thank you for the question.
Leona, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, because it is something I'm kind of thinking about at this point as well. What is the role of AI? And I think what we have to do is say, well, what is AI currently not able to do? And, when we think about what are the pieces that AI is not great at right now, it's not great at building relationships. And so I think that the uptake for AI is really going to depend on what is the business model and, where can it best be used? If you're looking at a high-end retail sector, that's all person to person. The experience of going into a luxury goods store is around a person who's dealing with you, who's very close to you, who do you develop a rapport with. Maybe AI is running in the back end to do the evaluation of the person's purchase history and maybe looking at what new is coming in. I mean, there's that piece where I think for AI at this point, from where I'm looking at it, it's more for the transactional grunt work that can be done very quickly. And I'm thinking even in terms of, if you looked at the use of technology within the finance functions and get AI to start going through those business expenses, looking at those different reports and looking for the anomalies and looking for the patterns, that's really where it's going to be good to go. Are we really going to rely on AI to creatively redevelop something new for our strategic focus? I'm not sure it's there yet. So I think the question has to be, where can we use it? Where does it make sense to be used? And where does it make sense for us still to be looking at people and the relationships, and how important are people in relationships to different parts of the job that we're doing? So it's not sort of a company overall. From my perspective, it's, when you take a look at your organization, where could the tool add value? Where do you still need to develop the human competence? And what's running in the background for me is I was looking at some stats that are coming out of OECD. And out of OECD, it shows that Canada has the highest percentage of post-secondary education people. But for productivity, we sit at 28 over 39. So we're highest educated, but our productivity is like in the basement. And, when they looked at reasons for why, part of it, of course, is CapEx. And we know that, we don't always get the capital expenditures that we need here in Canada. But part of it was also around sales, not developing out sales skills properly enough. And a lot of that, the face-to-face stuff, is not going to be done by AI. AI can do the background research, but it's still going to be a person picking up the phone and calling somebody for a meeting to create that business opportunity. That's the people side of it. But then also it's that whole use of technology within our own businesses, and it's around performance management. And so when, I kind of take a look at it from the productivity lens, how does AI fit in? It has its place. But, if we're going to take a look at businesses overall and sort of the strategic transformation piece, how much of it do we really kind of put back to where is the level of training for management? So, a question that I asked at one company that I worked at, the CEO was complaining about an employee. And I said, so what was the person like when they started? So she was really good. I said, well, what's happened since? And there was like this little pause. And they said, well, good question. And then he moved on. So it's like, what do we do to people? And what do we do to people's capabilities, their motivation, their willingness to drive, their interest in trying new things and exploring? What do we do to them? And so, part of that for me in that context was, so what happens to you when you make a mistake? And if you get your head bit off and you feel like you're going to be shown the door, then the likelihood of adopting innovation is going to drop. So, how do you open all of this up? So AI, I think, is an important part of it. But I think we also have to take a look at how are we utilizing our people and what are we doing in terms of management training. And, I'm not saying it's all management's fault that our productivity levels are low, but we can't say that management doesn't have some responsibility for that. And so
Well,
how do we look at how are we motivating people and bringing them forward? And how are we organizing our companies to make sure that they are very efficient?
the real question is really what's the highest and best use for every single employee? And by the way, yes, we should also apply that to AI, right? Whether it's agents or large language models or chatbots or whatever, something built into some program or whatever. The biggest challenge is in relationships. This is a really stupid example, but many people despise having to respond to some company by writing into info at whatever, or sales at whatever, or service at whatever. They actually want to know that there's actually somebody responsible for actually doing whatever it is. Otherwise, every transaction boils down to price. What's the cheapest? Is when there's no relationship angle to it. It's a real mess. When we talk about employee engagement or employee retention, etc., There's no retention at such and such.com. Okay, it's a real person, the manager that asks the question, the employee has the conversation with, right? And it's that synthesis between two people that can actually move things up. So the question of where does AI fit in? Well, in that particular case, it's certainly not kind of where it needs to be. But I do also think that if we wanted to say, how might we as HR leaders wish to use the technology? I do think that there's a role to say, you know what are the experiments that we want to put in place? What are the ideas that we want to test drive just to see what the pickup is? And I don't, a simple example which is somewhat relevant. I was helping another organization. They had this very, very big complex policy, right? It was very complex. It was like 20 pages, and nobody could ever understand what it is. So I said, well, let's see about putting that into AI, Claude in this particular case, and come out with a flow chart, which, by the way, now on one page, there's something that's very, very easy for people to understand. That doesn't speak to relationships. That speaks to having a technology gobble through something to make it more understandable in one way or the other. But who's making that suggestion? Is it the HR people or is it somebody in IT? Right? I'm advocating for being a bit forward in terms of doing some of these experiments. Okay, rather than just abdicating abdicating that responsibilities to other departments. Um, Leona, I don't think that's what you're saying, that you're advocating one way or the other. I just think that it's an interesting
Mhm.
thing about how do you position the role of a chief HR leader than anything else.
Leona, what's on your mind?
Well, one comment I wanted to make, and just picking up on what Randall was saying earlier about the use of AI in recruiting, there is something that had come out. I can send you the link for it afterwards, but it was a company that was recruiting somebody for a work at home data security role. And they had all of these resumes that came through. They used AI. They found the best candidate. They got onto the interview. And when they were doing the interview, they realized that the voice and the lips were not syncing up properly. And they realized they were interviewing a deep fake. And so there has been some commentary that there are a few countries where this is one of the ways that they are infiltrating organizations. And so when we're using the technology, I think we also have to ask ourselves, you know, maybe there are some roles that shouldn't be work at home roles, and maybe there should be still some face-to-face meetings that are happening for some of these very sensitive types of roles. So I was quite surprised by that.
I think that's interesting. I'll just sort of add to that I think this is one of the biggest challenges and disconnects between executive management and the rank and file, where the senior execs want everybody to be back at the office 100%. And by the way, we all know there's great rationale for that. There's mentorship. Okay, there's more um, innovation and creativity when people are together. It's much easier to build that culture. So we know there's all these things. Yet on the other hand, we've got a workforce who says, "I'm not so sure spending 90 minutes of my life every single day in transit is really adding value to me, nor the company for that matter." Gee, when I'm in the office, most of my time I'm spending on Teams or Zoom, talking with all kinds of other people who are remote, whether it's clients or suppliers or partners or whoever it happens to be. And gee, by the way, it's just a lot more efficient if I'm working. So I know there's big rationale and good reasons for that too. And I just think that there's a disconnect that every organization is kind of working through in its own way, and we'll have to see how it lands at the very end. Other than to say that I think that senior leaders need to understand a little bit more from a rank and file employee's perspective. And the rank and file employees have got to understand that perhaps over the short term, it might be a good thing to be work from home all the time, but you're missing an opportunity, a career opportunity, if you're not spending time in person with those who are part of your organization, right? So I think there's got to be a bit of movement on both sides, but I see this over and over, certainly in our clients and others that we speak to, that there's a bit of a disconnect.
I want to talk about organizational culture. The people, there make the culture. Every single person and department and leader certainly contributes. When it comes to that, culture recipe, that brand recipe, does HR carry more weight, or is it just another agent like towing the leadership's direction?
I could think of a whole bunch of clients that I'd answered very differently. I think that when there's a weak HR leader, okay, nature abhors a vacuum and things, get filled in. And sometimes by people who don't have the skills or perspective, and therefore the end culture might be going in not the way it should be, right? On the other hand, I know other times where it's quote delegated to HR, which thank you is a staff department. It's not a line department, and it's very hard to be a super strong HR leader and HR department in charge of everything when you don't know what's happening in all the different line spaces. So I think that once again, different companies have a different history and everything, and they all have different futures. But I think understanding what that synthesis is between strong HR leadership in a way that empowers as opposed to takes the place of yet not so weak that the opportunity to have a cohesive culture, is done. And let me be practical about this. You know, as listeners may know, we do leadership retreats amongst other things, right? And what's the role of education? What's the role of getting everybody aligned on the same page, right? How do we build culture if we don't spend time as a leadership team together synchronizing on what that actually means, right? And I think that these are the kinds of things that sometimes get forgotten, right? And where is the HR component in terms of saying, here's our objectives for the leadership retreat? Because sometimes a leadership retreat is something which is, well, thank you very much. We're getting together because this is when we review the budgets. Okay. And very good. We're going to do high ropes as well and maybe do a winery tour. Right. And that's fine. That's a finance driven retreat. But I know some very capable CFOs who recognize, yes, that has to happen, but the culture, the people, the relationships, the conversations, sometimes the coaching, if it involves us, okay, of key people, that's the kind of thing that builds a culture that makes everything else possible, right? And I think that HR's got something to say about that. I'm talking about HR leadership should have something to say about that.
Leona, thoughts?
No, I agree with what's being said because really it depends on the company and it really depends on, I think, the CEO and how much the CEO is considering their role of, I am the coordinator of all of these people who are reporting to me and all of these different voices, and let's make it all happen, as opposed to the kind of leader who really feels like, this is my baby, I'll tell all of you what to do. And in that kind of a situation, I don't think HR can be so impactful. I think I've been in companies where HR was completely decentralized, from the corporate piece, and it can go in a variety of different ways. You can end up with HR practices, particularly around training and development and compensation, that can become very fragmented within the same organization, as opposed to something where everybody's kind of going in the same direction and everybody really feels like, I'm part of something, here's my contribution to the bigger mission. It really is all over the place. And how it works best, it really does depend on the organization and how it's been set up. And I think a lot of that ties back into the performance management and the responsibility for the budgets. And if we're going to delegate all of the training budgets to the different division heads, then what are they doing with it? Where's the accountability metric of it? Quite often, a lot of this is delegated, but then there's no follow through to say, well, what really are you doing? And let's take a look at, let's do that little 9 box exercise. How many people are you preparing for bigger and better? Or do you have a team of, steady runners where
Yeah.
you have no upside?
Let me just sort of amplify what you're saying in a different way. It's not just a question of decentralized HR budgets, okay, or training budgets, for example, between different divisions. It's also by function. So thank you very much. The VP of Sales is going to have their annual kickoff, and they're going to have everybody in sales and marketing and business development there, and they're getting one message. Then over here, you got the finance team, and they get a different message. And by the way, customer support is very, very different. So we're going to do our own thing over here, right? And so where's the alignment, right? I mean, that's where retreats can come in, etc. Where's the common message that's going everywhere? Well, thank you very much. You know, they might have a very strong CEO in those cases who sort of broadcasts from on high, right? But where's the reinforcement of that messaging? And follow the money. How's every functional area, how's every division actually choosing to spend it and is actually being effective? What's the mechanism so they can learn from each other, right? You know, I don't want to say it's a dog's breakfast, but what I see is the decimation of the HR function over the last decade or two has meant that some of these questions that we're talking about today are not being asked because the people who are running the show sometimes don't know the right questions to ask. They can know the answers if they knew the questions. And I think that when we talk about transformational, strategic HR leadership, you don't need to do everything, but you need to be able to ask the right questions and whisper in the ears of the CEO so that you could build authority, build trust, but also have better outcomes and get the support for the initiatives that you know are necessary.
All of the statistics show us that, employees are operating at a subpar level. Employee engagement is quite depressed. This is chronic, yet almost uniquely, Randall, when I hear you talk about your career and the organizations you've worked at and the ones you've run, you describe like only like top performers, like a total amazing experience with all these colleagues that challenge you and inspire you and impress you. Like, what is it that the organizations you've worked for and run is getting right when it's completely chronic that employees are phoning it in, as we used to say? With that, we're going to break right here. This part one on transformational HR, strategic human resources for a growing organization. We'll pick up with more Q&A in part two. But if anything we talked about so far resonates with you, if you're curious about business growth coaching or how to better align your team or planning your next retreat, do reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and share resources. You can email us at info@randallcraig.com or book a call at www.randallcraig.net/30, and we'll see you back for part two.